Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. Great to see you again. We are going to be talking today about Jewish nationalism, but we're also moving a little bit from west to east. Last time when we talked about anti-Semitism and the 19th century rise of the Jews, we were primarily looking at Jews in Western Europe, particularly in Germany, parts of Poland, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. When we talk about Jewish nationalism, we are moving to some extent to Eastern Europe, although, of course, the movements of Zionism and Jewish socialism, Jewish nationalism more broadly, were impactful on the West, as we'll see in a very important way, even in the British Empire. But by and large, the question that both East and Western Europe had to face, either after the process of Jewish emancipation and citizenship, or looking at the prospect of Jewish emancipation and citizenship, was the question of what are the Jews? And it's a question the Jews themselves had to answer, because before emancipation and well into the 19th century in Eastern Europe, in Poland and Russia and the Baltic states, Jewishness had been a total identity. It included religion, it included your culture, it included the language you spoke, it included your right of residence. Remember, Jews were only allowed to live as a Jewish community, not as individual citizens. It even included what was at the time called your nation. We might today call it an ethnicity, but when you refer to your nation, you weren't a French Jew before emancipation. You were a Jew in France. Your nation was the Jewish nation. And so you had no problem referring to Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel, or imagining a return to the land of Israel, a rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, a reestablishment of Jewish political independence under a Mashiach, an anointed king or Messiah, as we say in English. Your Jewishness was total and separating you from the surrounding culture. The Jews did not see themselves, and they were not seen by their neighbors as being native to the place. They might have been there forever or for centuries, but they were still seen as something else, not Polish, not Russian. Now, with the emancipation, with the opportunity to become citizens, Jews had to decide, are we going to change who we are to take advantage of this new opportunity? And if so, how far and in what direction? So here are a few options that were available to Jews. We're going to focus on the last one, number 6, today, but these were all available to Jews in this period of emancipation. One was, you could take the Heinrich Heine route. You could convert into some kind of low-key Christianity and fully integrate into the new national culture with your citizenship. And really, you would no longer be Jewish, and your future would no longer be Jewish. Although there were cases where converted Jews hung out with other converted Jews and intermarried between converted Jewish families. So are they still Jewish? Are they not Jewish? It's an interesting debate and question. But the end result is that conversion leads to a much less Jewish future, certainly, for those families and for that individual. They're just a German. And to make themselves just a German, they'll become a Protestant or Catholic. A second option was, and this is more popular at the end of the 19th century, you could fully integrate international culture, but without having to bother to convert anymore. Society has become secularized enough by the latter part of the 19th century that you don't have to convert to be a professor at university, to be a composer who's employable. You know, Gustav Mahler had to convert because he wanted to be a composer. Only jobs were in churches. By the end of the 19th century, you didn't have to convert to do that. You could accept that you had Jewish roots, but really you were part of a cosmopolitan high culture of your national adopted homeland. You might say, I was born Jewish, but my future would be to be just German without having to bother with the religion question. A third option was you could decide that you wanted to be just human globally and forget national boundaries and identities. You would be an internationalist. You would just be a human being, not any particular national, cultural, ethnic identity. So I think about people like Leon Trotsky, who was part of the Bolshevik Revolution, who was a pure internationalist. He was born Lev Bronstein to a Jewish family, but he took his revolutionary name of Leon Trotsky and wanted nothing to do with particular Jewish connections. Another example was the revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg, who has a very powerful passage where she says, why are you bringing me these specific Jewish concerns? My heart burns for the Africans on the rubber plantations and for the urban proletariat. I have no room in my heart for just Jewish suffering. It's all of human suffering. So don't be parochial and limited. Or one other example you might know of is a man named Ludwig Zamenhof, who grew up in Poland and was in a mixed community that had Germans and Russians and Jews speaking Yiddish and Poles, and they all hated each other. And so he decided that the root of their problem was they couldn't even communicate with each other. And he would create a universal language that would be easy to learn and everybody could speak. It still exists. It's called Esperanto. Now, it is, of course, Latin-based. It's European-based, but his goal was at least to bridge that gap. And it's actually a relatively easy language to learn, as far as I know. It's got a few basic rules and no exceptions to those rules. And the rest is vocabulary and grammar, and then on you go. But what would happen when Esperanto started was you would have Esperanto conferences, and there would be speeches in Esperanto and songs in Esperanto and poetry in Esperanto. And then after the conference ended, everybody would go back to speaking Yiddish. You see, the attraction of the pure internationalism was very attractive to Jews because they could now be part of a global humanity. They wouldn't be restricted by their particular origins. And in some cases, they were attracted to the revolutionary political ideology. We'll talk a bit more about socialism in a little bit. And that also led them into this international, leaving behind their Jewishness approach. Now, a fourth option for Jews in emancipation was to become national citizens of their country and redefine their Jewishness as primarily or even only a religion. So they would be Germans of the Mosaic faith. Their nationality was German or American or English or French, and their religion was Judaism, like Protestants, like Catholics. After all, the Prussian Empire, the United German Empire of 1870, had a substantial Catholic population in the south and a substantial Protestant population in the north. And so Jews thought, well, we can be just another one of those religious sects under the German nation. And that's how they would identify with their religion, as simply, that's where they fit their Jewishness. One example of this comes from a poem actually written in Eastern Europe, where the famous line is, the man says, "You should be a man on the street and a Jew in your tent." In other words, your Jewishness is a private thing. It doesn't affect your outward behavior or your participation in society. Your Jewishness is in the private sphere, in the voluntary association of a synagogue, or in the private behavior of a home Passover Seder or something like that. That's where your Jewishness should be restricted. Now, this is the origins of Reform Judaism, which, in fact, in one famous statement in the 1880s in America, said, "We are no longer a nation, we are only a religion." We'll see that statement. It's called the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885. We'll see that when we talk about American Judaism in a couple of weeks. Now, Reform Judaism often gets a bad rap because of this rejection of national identity, but I will point out, given the alternatives of internationalism, fully integrating into national culture as a cosmopolitan, and converting, Reform Judaism was a way to be a citizen and stay Jewish. It wasn't a route or a strategy for Jewish survival. And so they should get credit for that. Now, another option was to try to maintain that separate total identity as much as possible. You want to maintain a separate language, maintain separate dietary practices, maintain a distinct dress, maintain an insular community, follow your own laws. Remember the Napoleonic questions about what laws do you follow? This is what we might call modern Orthodox or even ultra-Orthodox Judaism today, where they'll use cell phones, they take American citizenship, but they try to maintain as separate an identity as possible based on that pre-Enlightenment, pre-emancipation model. But that includes a national identity too. It's not only a religion. Now, the last option we're going to talk about today in more focus, as you know, the first 15 minutes is just saying what we're not going to talk about, is understanding Jewishness as a national or an ethnic identity, where your citizenship may be one thing, but if you're living in a multi-ethnic empire like the Russian Empire, or for that matter, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had all the Balkan nationalities and religions and ethnicities and combinations of religion and ethnicity, because you had Bosnian Christians and Bosnian Serbs and Croatian Muslims and the cross lines were all over the place. The understanding was that Jewishness could be understood as a national ethnic culture, like Ukrainian, like Lithuanian, like Serbian. You could also be Jewish. And so this would include biology, a sense of descent and common community. It would include your particular language and your national culture. It would include a sense of a national destiny that we are going to be going into together. It could include a concept of self-determination, either cultural self-determination, like running your own schools, publishing your own newspapers, or even it could include a kind of political self-determination, as we see in Europe after World War I. Woodrow Wilson comes out with this brilliant idea of national self-determination, and then he has to decide how small do we want to go here on breaking down these groups into national self-determination, and what do you do about dispersed groups like the Jews who fit the major definition characteristics of a nation, of a national group with language and culture and heritage and identity and ethnicity, but they're all over the place. They don't have a territory that's there, so how can we give them national self-determination? This will also help you make sense of the Zionist movement, because in many ways, modern Zionism is a 19th century European ethnic nationalism. That's its sort of pedigree, intellectually or ideologically. And so if you think about Serbian nationalism or Polish nationalism from that period, certainly the interwar period, 1919 to 1939, you'll have an interesting parallel to the Zionist movement's ideology, at least in the founding generation of the state. So let me take you back 125 years. I've actually been teaching this long enough that my notes said 100 years ago, but now it's actually 125 years ago. There were two movements of Jewish nationalism that were founded in the same year. This was in 1897. So I'm going to just describe both movements, and you'll tell me which was a radical dream and which was realistic. The first group in 1897 met in Basel in Switzerland, and they imagined that they would collect all the Jews from all over the world and get them to move to a small corner of the Ottoman Empire that was very undeveloped, and they would then somehow manage to gain international recognition of their project such that they would be able to declare an independent state where all the Jews moving there would start speaking Hebrew, which they hadn't spoken as a living language in 2,000 years. The second movement was founded in Vilna in Eastern Europe. It was the Bund, which stands for the Jewish Labor Movement Organization in Yiddish. Its goal was to advocate for Jewish workers and the Jewish masses in the language in which they already spoke in Eastern Europe, which was Yiddish, to defend their national cultural rights to publish newspapers in Yiddish, to organize schools in Yiddish. They wanted to fix the Jewish problems where they were, often through political overthrow, revolution, or radical economic reform. And they saw their strength as based in the masses of people who already spoke this cultural language, who already had a working experience as part of the working class. And their goal was Jewish nationalism, but in Eastern Europe and in Yiddish already. Now, which was the radical dream and which was the realistic strategic plan? Okay, so if you'd lived in that time and place, you might have made a choice. Now, of course, the Jewish Bund did exist into the 1930s. It was one of the strongest movements, including educational movements, school movements, and so on in Poland in between World War I and World War II. And it would be even stronger today if not for the Holocaust and the killing of millions of Yiddish speakers. I mean, it did not die a natural death, let's put it that way. Even so, both the political Zionism looking to move to Israel, and which we call Zionism, and the cultural nationalism based in Eastern Europe of the Bund and allied organizations were based on two major disappointments that took place at the end of the 19th century. The first was in the 1880s, there was a huge wave of pogroms against Jews in the Russian Empire after the assassination of the Tsar. And what wound up happening was the socialists who were active at the time actually cheered these pogroms because they said, look, the masses can be mobilized to act. And the Jewish socialists who had been inclined toward internationalism until that point said, what are you talking about? They're not attacking the Tsar, they're not attacking the capitalists, they're attacking the Jews. And the non-Jewish socialists said, right, they're attacking the blood-sucking capitalists. And the Jewish socialists said, what? So there was a real break from the internationalist or even Russian revolutionary socialist tradition by Jews who still felt an affinity to their people, to their heritage, and on some level, albeit in a more secular way. You'll notice, by the way, that Jewishness as a national identity could include religion, but by the end of the 19th century, that was seen as simply one of many features of what it meant to be Jewish, not even as the predominant one. So the first disappointment was a series of pogroms that continued into the early 1900s. Even during World War I, there were a series of them as well. The other major disillusionment took place in Western Europe. And this is in 1894, where a captain in the French army, whose name is Alfred Dreyfus, is put on trial for treason as a scapegoat for the French defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. And it turns out the evidence was forged, but he was nevertheless convicted and sent to Devil's Island. And at the trial, the crowds outside were chanting, "Down with the Jews, down with the Jews." This is the culmination of a period of real popularization of the kind of almost racialist anti-Semitism we talked about last time in Western Europe. There was Houston Stewart Chamberlain in England. There was Drummond in France, who wrote La France Juive, the Jewish France, talking about the infection of France by Jewish ideas and even people. Now, watching that trial was a journalist from Vienna, whose name was Theodor Herzl. At the time, he wasn't that well known, but he would ultimately see the Dreyfus trial, the rise of anti-Semitism in Western Europe, as the colossal failure of those other strategies. The conversion, the integration, the Jewishness as only a religion, it didn't work. They're never going to let us be. After all, Dreyfus was integrated. He's fluent. He made it. He's not a private in the army. He's not a lieutenant. He was a captain in the French army. And they threw him under the bus. And the crowds chanted, "Down with the Jews." So the integration strategy is not going to work. It's not going to solve the problem of what to do about the Jews and what are the Jews. So between the disillusionment with the internationalism of socialism, which was in favor of revolution for its own sake, regardless of who got attacked, the immediate needs of Jewish workers for addressing their concerns about cultural usage and respect, and recognition of the right of Jewish workers to use Yiddish in their national and political lives in the Russian Empire, and the Western European failure of integration, as exemplified by the Dreyfus trial, it led to this burgeoning of interest in a Jewish national solution that would address the Jews as a people. And that's why both the World Zionist Organization and the Jewish Bund were founded in 1897 in the aftermath of these disillusionments. So to first talk a little bit about the ideology of Jewish socialism or Yiddishism. It was not, again, pure socialism with no ethnic cultural identity. It was a Jewish socialism. So it was based on the national experience of Jewish workers who needed specific advocacy for their rights. There's a famous short story called A Union for Shabbos, where the Jewish workers organized to be able to get Saturday off in their sweatshop. Ironically, in that story, the boss is Jewish of the sweatshop as well, but they have to organize to get him to give them their Sabbath off. But you also have them wanting to focus on Jewish language as a cultural language, just like the Ukrainians are focusing on Ukrainian. In fact, Ukrainian isn't written down, I believe, until the 19th century. It's a peasant language, it's spoken, but it isn't formally written down until much later. And again, all these other ethnic nationalism at the same time. The Bund starts as a universalist socialist group, but hearing back from its workers, it begins to advocate for the right to use Yiddish language in newspapers, in schools, in local elections, and so on. As I mentioned, they focused on a concept of fixing Jewish problems here and now. They used the phrase in Yiddish, doigkeit. Do means here, doigkeit means here-ness. We're going to fix our problems where we are, in the language we're in the working class we're in, and let's address these problems directly. But lest you think they are purely practical, they did have a kind of utopianism to it. There's a book describing Jewish socialist movements that's titled While Messiah Tarried. And it actually presents Jewish socialism as a kind of substitute messianism, where instead of expecting the messianic age of restoration of Jewish rights in Israel, you have the messianic age of the revolution of the proletariat and the establishment of the communist paradise, which is its own kind of utopian thinking, with its own kind of dangers of utopian thinking, as I'll say. But the idea of having an idealism of working for the cause is sort of shifted from this hoping for the Messiah to hoping for the proletarian revolution and working for that kind of ultimate end result. But there are millions of Jews who grew up in these communities and schools who learned to speak Yiddish as a living language. Even after they had the chance to become Polish citizens or Russian citizens, they maintained a love of Yiddish culture as the vehicle for Jewish identity, and many of them, following socialism, were very secularized as well. So the other Jewish national movement is this concept of Zionism, which actually has roots before Herzl and before the Dreyfus trial. There was a movement in the early 1880s called the Bilu movement, which wanted to move Jews there and tried to encourage them to move, but that was it worked for a few intellectuals, but it was a flop for most Jews. In 1882, a man named Leon Pinsker wrote a book called Auto-Emancipation. You can tell from the title, Free Yourself, right? Don't wait for someone else to free you. And then Herzl, after the Dreyfus trial, writes a book called The Jewish State, which dramatizes his claims of the fact that we won't be integrated and describes his mission of how we're going to create a state on the ground and with political permission from the European powers. The basic thesis of Zionism was that anti-Semitism is endemic. You're not going to fix it by assimilating to German or Russian culture. You're not going to fix anti-Semitism by being just a religion. You're not going to fix anti-Semitism through a socialist revolution either, because anti-Semitism comes from the fact that the Jews are a nation, but they're a ghost nation. Their kingdom, their body died, and yet their spirit flitted around for the last 2,000 years. And it scares people, because what does it mean to be a nation without a political territory of your own? You hear that 19th century nationalist message there. So what the Jews need is to become normalized like other nations in their own land with a majority and give up on Europe. It's unfixable. The anti-Semitism is too endemic. They will never let us be fully integrated. In vain, Herzl writes, do we die for our country? In vain do we contribute to the national culture. We might as well be our own person and our own nation. So in the end, we need to change the paradigm. And Zionism was also a kind of revolutionary movement, because remember, the Orthodox didn't think they had a long time in Europe either. They were just waiting for the Messiah to do it for them. The new Jew now doesn't wait for a Messiah. That Bilu movement stood for Beit Yaakov Lechu Nelcha, House of Jacob, get up and go. We're just going to do it. We don't need the Messiah anymore. We will be the ones who will enact next year in Jerusalem. Instead of praying for it at the end of the Passover Seder, we're going to make it happen by moving there. It'll be next week in Jerusalem, or next 2 months, given the transportation at the time. And remember, of course, Palestine in the territory at this time is under the Ottoman Empire. So it's going to take a lot of negotiation to try to get freedom for a Jewish state in the land of Israel. There was actually a debate at one point early in the Zionist movement about possibly getting a grant for land in British East Africa, what is today Uganda, as a possible territorial solution to the suffering of Jews in Eastern Europe. Herzl brought that back to the Zionist Congress and almost had a heart attack from the response he got, because people said, no bleeping way. It's called Zionism. What's Zion? Zion is one of the hills in Jerusalem. It is not a mountain in Uganda. If we are Zionism, there is one and only one place that we should aim for, that we could possibly convince people to move to. There is no alternative. And so they rejected the Uganda proposal, and it was Palestine, Israel, Canaan, whatever you wanted to call it. The Levant is the geographic term, or bust. But of course, that doesn't mean the Zionists all agreed. Surprise, surprise. They had different political strategies. So one approach to Zionism was called political Zionism. This was Herzl's preferred mode, and that was to meet with important figures, the Kaiser, the Ottoman Sultan, the British Foreign Office, to try to get a grant or a charter from a world power that justified the Jews building a national homeland in the land of their national origins. Another strategy of Zionism was called Socialist Zionism, which understood the fact that the Jews are still a working class people. They're not these intellectuals in Western Europe who are going to go negotiate in the halls of power. So we need to find a solution that works for the masses, not just the intellectual elite. And the idea was to make your returning to the land, and more importantly, you're returning to the physical land, the farming, to be a positive ideology. The phrase was livnot et haaretz v'lehibanot ba, to build the land and be built by the land. Or the very work of building roads, of establishing farming settlements, of building houses and industries, that will in fact build ourselves, and we will become not the old Jew of Europe, who was old and gray and bent and wear glasses and weak and passive. We will be the new Jew, who is strong and stands tall and fights back and is active and does things in the real world with their hands, and is not a middleman negotiator who goes between different people just making money. Let's make things and not money. That was the Socialist Zionist ideology, and it became the basis of the kibbutz movement. Many of the early settlers in what was called the Yishuv, the Jewish settlement, came from this ideology. If you think of David Ben-Gurion or Golda Meir, Moshe Dayan, all of these figures are from that founding Socialist Zionist ethos. But there was a rejection of that too, because some people were still secular Zionists, but they were more interested in private property. They realized that not everybody wants to live on a communal farm and not have their kids live with them in their own home, and not even own their own pants, and have that to be the property of the kibbutz. They wanted to have some private property, and they were not as interested in the socialist approach of world humanity. They were focused on, what do the Jews need for the Jews? And other people can worry about themselves. We're going to worry about our people. This is often called the Revisionist Zionist approach. Its founding thinker was a man named Zev Jabotinsky, who fought in the British Jewish Legion during the First World War. And it is the ancestor of what is today the Likud party. You can hear some of the ideology that's parallel of, we're interested in what's in it for the Jews, and other people can deal with themselves. So one example demonstrating the ideology of the revisionists was, they had a slogan in one of their militant offshoots that had a map of the old map of Palestine before the partition that made Jordan into a separate country in the 1920s. So it was greater Israel in the Palestine province definition of the Ottoman Empire. And they would show a fist holding a rifle over that map. And the phrase was, Rak Kach, only thus. So we are going to get as much territory as we can because our need is the most dire. And if we have to use weaponry to do it, then by God, we're going to do that, because our need is great enough to justify any means. The revisionists were a much more militant and a much more maximalist political strategy. And there were also religious Zionists. I don't want to say that the religious totally rejected Zionism. There were some who saw these secular Zionist activists as tools of the Messiah in bringing Jews back to the land of Israel and enabling them to settle there. Even if they were not so observant, the religious Zionists felt there were certain commandments you could only observe in the land of Israel, so they should move back and be able to do those even before there was a political state. This is the founder of what today is the National Religious Party, or National Religious School stream. Many of them also have become the backbone of the settler movement of the West Bank. Again, you can see echoes of that ideology in modern trends. But the biggest success of the Zionist movement pre-World War II was the issuing of exactly that kind of international charter that Herzl had been hoping for. It was called the Balfour Declaration. And what the Balfour Declaration enabled was the possibility of creating a Jewish state in the land of Palestine, but the wording proved to be quite dicey. So I want to read this to you as it is, and then I'll read it to you as it was before it was edited, and you'll see the difference. So you have this statement to Lord Rothschild, who again is working in the circles of power, right, with Lord Balfour. They're both in the House of Lords. And here's the key paragraph in the middle. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. And please pass this on. So what this describes is the creation in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The original wording of the document was His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment of Palestine as the national home for the Jewish people. So the original wording would have been all of historic Palestine being designated as the national home for the Jewish people. But between not wanting to undermine the status of Jews in other countries, because after all, if the Jews have the national home, the only one, then they better go there. Also dealing with the rights of the non-Jewish communities in those territories, what today we might call the Palestinians. And because the British, as we know through the 20th century, have this pattern of trying to split up countries that are really hard to split up. Look at India and Pakistan. It's another example. They decide that the best solution is to make part of Palestine a national home for the Jewish people. And honestly, a national home doesn't necessarily mean a separate state. Maybe they'll be like the national home of the Hindus, aka the British Raj in India in 1917. And maybe they won't need to have separate independence. What you see in both of these national movements, whether it's Jewish socialism and Yiddishism or Zionism, is a complete national identity. It includes language. It includes a feeling of community. They ran their own school system. They ran their own youth movements and summer camps. They had created their own culture. They both had their own sense of mission and purpose in the world. So it really did fit the definition of a full identity if that mission fits in the space where religion traditionally fits. They had their rituals. They had their anthems, they had their holy sites, they had their martyrs, they had all those features, because after all, nationalism on some level is a kind of substitution of religion. And you see it in a lot of different ways. Just watch what happens if you don't stand for the national anthem in the United States. Now, this Jewish nationalism and a sense of Jewish ethnic connection extended even beyond these movements, because you have mass immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe to North America. And there's an organization founded called the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which is designed to help these poor, benighted Eastern European Jews get integrated and assimilated by the wealthy and more integrated German Jews who have been there for 40 years, or recently before in most cases. And so the challenge is that they have almost nothing in common, because the Jews coming from Eastern Europe are either radical socialists and anti-religion or traditionalist Orthodox. And they go into these Reformed temples and think it's a church because there's pews and there's an organ and people are singing and nobody's wearing a head covering. And what is this ridiculousness? So the Reformed Jews have to come up with a phrase to make sense of why they're helping these people who have nothing in common with them religiously. They call them their co-religionists, even though they have nothing in common by any definition of religion. But it's still the sense of responsibility for these people who are part of our people, even if we don't want to call them a people. And a similar kind of process happened with French Jews, because in 1860, an organization was founded called the Alliance Israelite Universelle, the Universal Jewish or Israelite Alliance, that was created to advocate for Jews in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. There was a terrible blood libel accusation in Damascus in 1840 that led to a lot of Jewish attempts to advocate for Jews in the international political arena, both in America and in Europe, by the way. And in the end, the Alliance Israelite was trying to uplift the Jews there by providing them modern European educations in French and science and mathematics and so on, while also advocating for their communities in North Africa, in the Balkans, and in the Arabic-speaking Middle East. And again, it was integrationist French Jews who were doing this for Jews in the Middle East who were living in these separate whole communities and had a more national kind of experience. And lest you think that Zionism was the overwhelming success that it's been in the Western Jewish experience in the 20th century, with some more critique coming into the 21st century, both of these Jewish nationalisms, of Jewish socialism and of Zionism were rejected by both the religious establishment, who said it's chutzpah to try to push for the Messiah and to move to Israel before it's there, or to reject religion and just do Yiddish for Yiddish's sake. And they were also rejected by the Reform movement. Remember, the Reform movement is integrationist. The Reform movement wants us to be Germans of the Mosaic faith, and you're undermining that by claiming we have a homeland somewhere else. My homeland is here. In the first prayer book in America that was translated into English, so you had Hebrew on one side, English on the other, it was called Minhag America, the custom of America. And they printed the Star-Spangled Banner as one of the hymns in the back of the book. It's why, by the way, the Reform movement said, this is our Jerusalem. And they called their religious buildings they were building temples. Before that, you didn't call it a temple because there was one temple. It was in Jerusalem, and all that's left is one of the walls. You know, it was destroyed thousands of years ago. But now the Reform movement says, this is our homeland, this is our Jerusalem, so I can have a Cincinnati temple, or a Hamburg temple, or an East London temple. And in many communities, even to this day, most institutions that call themselves temple blah, 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 are Reform. There are a few who are conservative, but most are Reform. While Reform congregations call themselves congregation so-and-so, or Kehillah so-and-so, they have other terms for it, but they tend not to use the term temple because that's part of that claim to rootedness that the Reform movement made in rejecting that national identity. They also edited the prayer book, took out the prayers that said, return us to Israel, rebuild the temple, come to Messiah. They didn't want any hint of nationalism in their Jewishness. That was the integration model, where the conservative movement and the Orthodox movement kept those in, and the conservative movement was very friendly to Zionist thought, because they still had a kind of nationalist orientation, even if they were more religious than the secular labor Zionists. And of course, even within these movements, they would argue with each other. So in the broad trend of Jewish socialism, there were major arguments. Even in the trend of labor Zionism, there were arguments. At one time, there were two major parties. There were Labor Zionist A and Labor Zionist B. They wouldn't even pick a different name because they wouldn't give the other group the satisfaction of being able to claim that they were labor Zionism. And part of the split was over, were they pro-Soviet Union or anti-Soviet Union? You know, were they pro-socialist but anti-Soviet and anti-Stalin, and that kind of arguing debate took place in America too, by the way. The same is true, by the way, with kibbutz. The first kibbutz was called Kibbutz Degania. It's a beautiful kibbutz on the Sea of Galilee. There was a split, and they made Degania Bet, Degania B, because some people left from Degania A over who knows what. And in America as well, you had these rivalries. So you had three camps in upstate New York that were sort of on the same lake from each other. One was called Kinderland. That was the International Workers' Order, the Universalist Socialists who still did things in Yiddish because the masses spoke Yiddish. You had Kinderring, which was the Workmen's Circle. That's the American version of the Bund. So they were Jewish and socialist doing Yiddish, but not Zionist. And then you had a third camp called the Kinderwelt. So you have Kinderland, Kinderring, and Kinderwelt. Kinderwelt was run by the Farband, which was the labor Zionist organization that did things in Yiddish and in Hebrew. So every morning they would sing a different song as they raised a different flag. So the IWO school would sing the Internationale in Yiddish, and probably Yiddish and English after a while. The Workman's Circle school would sing Die Shavua, the vow, which was the Jewish Bund anthem that talks about their blood spurting forth, and that's why the flag is red and so on. And the labor Zionists would sing Hatikva while they raised their flag in their camp, probably in Hebrew and Yiddish too. So, you know, this is the reality of these rivalries among the different peoples. And to dramatize that, I want to close the opening presentation with a short movie clip. Comes from one of my favorites. They're not a Jewish troupe, but they get the nuances down so well. I've used them before. It's a piece from Monty Python's The Life of Brian that dramatizes this political infighting of the true believers. This was what some of these arguments were. And of course, part of the problem is that you're arguing over castles in the sky. You know, these are like the ideal world that you're building out of, you know, who knows what. When you get into the practicality of actually being in charge and doing things, then it gets much more tricky, you know, and accepting compromise and dealing with the difficult realities. And we'll talk more about the history of Israel proper and what happens to the Zionist movement when they actually meet their goal of getting a Jewish state after World War II, when we talk more about Israel in a couple of classes. And I mentioned as well, some of the comments were pointing out things like the Sykes-Picot Treaty and the promises to King Faisal that are detailed in Lawrence of Arabia, among other, fictional and real historical sources. We'll talk more about that as well when we get into the history of Israel proper. This is more looking at the ideology of nationalism as it was playing out in Eastern Europe and how that has ripple effects even today in Jewish life. After all, Bernie Sanders is not the first Jewish socialist to ever been out there. There's a long pedigree, and some people would claim roots with that in their own political activism even today.